it was concerning what you said about that all the rays are in a way equal. For instance, the first ray and the seventh ray are as equal important.
Absolutely.
That got me thinking about what I've taught about the seven rays, that there are three main rays: first, second, and third. The third ray, and then the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, and the seventh rays are sub rays to the third ray. So is that still the case, or is that not the case?
It's the case. In a sense, you could say that there are three different points of view. One is you could talk about spiritual development as a progression, because we live in physical bodies. This part of our nature kind of looks at spirituality in a lopsided way, because we're identified more with our bodies. That's our starting place as incarnate human beings. And so one of the things that naturally happens as our awareness expands, for instance, is that we become increasingly aware of the other planes, the other dimensions. And that kind of tends to lead people to assume that that's an important part of spirituality, like that might even be perceived as like the whole point is to expand into awareness of these planes, maybe even sort of journey into them and travel through the planes and so on. But actually, that's what I would call a relative point of view. It's something that appears to be the case because we're in bodies. So that's what sometimes is called the ascending model of spirituality. We climb through the planes, we ascend. We actually have other parts of our own nature that aren't identified with these bodies. Our inner self that, say, has residence on one of the intermediate planes doesn't look at spiritual development in quite the same way that our incarnate self does. So it doesn't necessarily look at spirituality from an ascending point of view. In fact, it might even have what it might be called an incarnational philosophy, where it feels like it's growing by incarnating, coming down. It thinks the seventh ray is great. That's what it's lacking more. And it wants to incarnate and come into denser dimensions so it can grow by being more balanced, by gaining the experience of those elements, those dimensions, and the qualities that come from that. So actually, there's a descending model too that's equally valid. It's just not as familiar to us because our spirituality is based on being the part that's in the body. So we think of it relative to that. But the third point of view, which is actually the deepest point of view, is what could be called the non-dual view. And that doesn't think that ascending or descending is the ultimate point of view. It says they're all equal. They're all equally important. In fact, it would be kind of like saying, which is more important, yin or yang? Well, just even looking at the yin or yang symbol, it's like, well, they're both like half of the symbol. You can't say one's more, which is more important, yes or no? Which is more important, male or female? They define each other. You can't separate them. Similarly, the actual spectrum of these planes is they're a spectrum between two poles, and those two polar realities define each other. You can't separate them. They're like yin and yang. So from an ascending point of view, because the ascending pattern has been deep in human spirituality for thousands of years, it's still kind of around tainting people's points of view. So some people will say, oh, the upper rays, they're kind of the better ones. I actually think that that's still an overlay of an ascending model, and that a truer, more non-dual point of view would say, no, those so-called upper rays In the same way we wouldn't say the higher chakras are better, and we wouldn't say that the higher planes are better or the higher elements are better, so the so-called higher rays are not better either. They're all equally contributing to our total wisdom, our total awakening. So that's a more radically non-dual point of view. It's not one that is well understood at this point. I do think that in certain traditions it's known, but see, our knowledge of this science in the sort of outer, I use this sort of analogy or metaphor that there are great ones behind the scenes. They have a kind of a lineage of their own. They might be outwardly affiliated with different traditions like Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, the Native American, but behind the veil, they're part of a kind of global planetary lineage. So there's one teaching there. Recently, they've made attempts to share some of their teaching with the outer traditions and people in the world in general. That always kind of goes on sort of behind the scenes. Like if you were to, say, live in a place like China 500 years ago, you may very well encounter one of these masters, and you might be, let's say, a Taoist, and your relationship with them might cause an infusion of some of their deeper wisdom into Taoism, slowly influencing it. So that's always going on around the world, that there's individuals physically and on inner planes, those masters are kind of gently stimulating the teachings around the world. But the core teachings, like the sevening as the septenary system that we're talking about now, it's never been profoundly revealed to the world. It's fairly advanced. As you can see, here we are talking for hours and hours about it. It's a bit complicated. It's kind of like doing, science. You spend time studying it. It's a little daunting. It's complicated. Intuitively, I promise you, intuitively, it's actually pretty simple. When you put it into words and stuff, it sounds very complicated. The inner fundamental intuitive understanding of it is very simple. It's when you kind of, as your intuition unfolds and you go deeper into it, it'll get clearer, simpler, more and more obvious, because all of the ways everything's interconnected just sort of stands there revealed in this effortless wholeness. But then you come down to a level of concepts and language and it starts to sound very complicated. But it's not. The goal is to reveal that inner simplicity, that intuitive clarity and simplicity that's really at the heart of it. But yes, on another level, it's kind of complicated. So that's one of the reasons it hasn't been revealed as much to the world, as it's kind of an advanced teaching. But it's coming out more and more. And in the last 140 years or so, some attempts have been made, particularly through people like Blavatsky and Bailey and others. But it's still early stages. There's still kind of overlays and misunderstandings and things. It's decent. It's a good foundation. It's a good starting point. But we really have centuries more work to do to kind of clarify. So in some ways, I feel like that's part of what my work is it's just the next step. It's not the final word, but it's the next step, contributing to that next step of clarification. And one of the things that often isn't realized about this community is that they generally tend to be radical non-dualists. Like if you look at the actual, say if you look at the letters, physical letters that masters like Kudhumi wrote, not what they channeled through other people, but things that they actually said. They spoke very clearly in terms of like embracing radical non-dual, like Advaita Vedanta, Mahayana teachings like Nagarjuna. These are radically non-dual teachings that, for instance, don't hierarchize the planes and say that higher planes are better. Like the Buddha, for instance, was very clear about that. He said, look, there are all these worlds. There are worlds based on the form elements. Beyond those, there are spacious, formless worlds based on the on finer elements like spaciousness and infinite consciousness that are beyond form altogether. And they said, be very careful to understand those worlds are not nirvana. They're not better. Nirvana is something entirely different than these various worlds. So Buddha was one of the, probably the clearest teachers to ever enunciate this very clear understanding. Do not confuse these various worlds from the denser, more form, and even darker, hellish worlds, so to speak, to intermediate worlds, to these deep, vast heaven worlds, and the beings that are there. There are some very powerful, spacious, even very benevolent beings that inhabit these realms, but if they haven't let go of them and pierce through the true nature of nirvana, they're not liberated. They're still part of samsara. Do not confuse this. So he was one of the, probably one of the first ancient masters in the outer world to clarify this more than it had ever been clarified before. But there's still insight to come about that. So if you subscribe to a cosmology, most traditions don't have as much clarity about that. So then if you filter the teachings of the rays through one of those points of view, like Bailey herself did not understand non-dualism this clearly. She was more influenced by Christianity, which is a creator deity point of view. And that is not a radically non-dual point of view. So it's a beautiful, lofty understanding, but it runs into a limit in terms of understanding radical non-dualism. And you can't really understand the true nature of the rays through that point of view, because it will tend to order them in a kind of hierarchical order. So both the planes, the chakras, even like the Hindu system is another one. Hindu chakra system also is one that tends to be tainted by that ascending cosmology too. For a different reason, it's not necessarily always a creator deity archetype or point of view, but it is still an ascending point of view that thinks higher chakras are better than lower chakras. Again, if you have that kind of point of view, you will have a misunderstanding of the rays. You won't have the deepest understanding of the rays. You might not even really understand the rays at all, because you wouldn't, how would you know, for instance, that there's 7? If you think that it's at the heart center that spirituality starts, and the lower 3 chakras are just kind of like the dark ones, the ego ones, then in a sense there's only 4 rays, 4 good qualities, 4 good chakras. That's not an understanding of the system. That's another distorted understanding. So you can see where this idea of the 3 best rays comes from. It's kind of like saying, well, the very best ones are kind of up here, In the Hindu ascending chakra system, the heart is actually usually considered a transition one. So even though it's considered more spiritual, you don't really get to the deeply spiritual ones to the throat. I think that that Bailey, unfortunately, was still being influenced by those classical ways of thinking. And so that's a good example of, like, if you have somebody on this side of the veil. Blavatsky did have one of the most important advantages Blavatsky had. Each of these teachers, had their pros and cons, but Blavatsky was physically trained by these masters for years. So she was directly initiated into more radically non-dual teachings and a more physically imparted understanding of the rays, for instance, of the planes, of the principles, of the nature of greater intelligences, archangels, and so on. So she actually was much clearer on the more non-dual aspect of the teaching. Bailey, nonetheless, because even though she didn't understand that quite as well, she had the advantage of spending years attuned to the Tibetan, and so there's some brilliant ideas that came through her as well that kind of helped enrich the system. At the same time, she didn't understand the non-dual aspect as well, so we have to kind of tweak that, kind of adjust that aspect of her contribution. So again, it's a bit of a complicated process of how to work with all of this and clarify it. And that's what we're kind of in the middle of now, is taking it to that next step of deepening and clarifying. Well, we can go into more of that as we go. I can show you more pieces of that process of that the clarification of all these teachings. So, Johnny, was there any follow-up to what I said before we take a break?
Oh, yes. Well, I'm just sitting here and wondering, was that a yes or a no or a both or a...
It's sort of, it's mostly a no, but it's kind of a little bit of a yes. I'm acknowledging that from a relative point of view, it can seem like that. But
Yeah.
that from a deeper point of view, no, no ray is, in my view, and I believe this reflects the actual view also of the Shambhala lineage, that there is no ray that's considered preferable to another ray, higher, more advanced, more essential, anything like that.
So that is I think it was Bailey that wrote about it. At least that's what I recall it was.
Yeah.
Maybe you can say something about how could she misunderstand it? How could she see that the last 4 rays was sub-rays to the 3rd rays? I mean, it seems pretty big mistake actually to make.
Yeah, I agree. You know, I love Bailey's teachings, and I feel an important sense of gratitude, because she was the first major teacher in that lineage that I studied, and she played a major role in my awakening to my own contact with that lineage and so on. There's many insights that she brought through that I think are brilliant, and that I think I hold her in high regard in that way. At the same time, I think it's important to sort of, in a sense, act like scientists, where, like scientists hold Newton in very high regard. He was instrumental in the development of, say, physics in general. And yet people don't retroactively say everything that Newton said was ideal. Science has moved on since then. And some of his theories still are useful within their own context, but other aspects of his understanding have been modified or rejected because there's better teachings now. It's the same way. We have to look at spirituality and esotericism and so on in the same way. It's a progressive development. So in the same way that I wouldn't look at Newton and say, oh, how could he have misunderstood that? Why didn't he get it better? Well, it's not so easy. This is difficult stuff to understand. And he did brilliant work for his time. I would literally say the same thing about Alice Bailey. She did brilliant work, and it's perfectly understandable to me why she didn't get it perfect, because it's a vast and profound teaching. And remember how I pointed out, let's see, in this, one of the things I did to make it a little bit easier is I put page numbers on the tops of the latest handouts, so that if you want, you can find what I'm talking about easier. And on page, looks like we go way back. Looks like it's page 9. There's a discussion of where the Tibetan physically materialized to a few theosophists, 3 theosophists. Remember, this is a story I've made reference to a couple of times before. And one of them is Leadbeater, but also Mr. Cooper Oakley, and a third, a Hindu brother, as Leadbeater referred to him. I suspect it was maybe Damodar. 3 of them were on the roof at Adyar, and the Tibetan, with his mastery of the elements, materialized, working with the earth element. He probably came in his astral body, and then he took into his imagination the earth element and imagined his astral body infused with the earth element, and that made it materialize in the physical world, took on physical form, so that he could interact with these theosophists. And notice one of the things he says here. He says, they ask him, Mr. Cooper Oakley says, oh, please, Master, will you tell us all about the rays? Because, at this point, Blavatsky had made reference to the rays dozens and dozens of times at this point in her various writings, especially in The Secret Doctrine. But she had never really explained in detail what they were. So they were still pretty curious about them. What are these rays? And so the Tibetan interestingly responds and says, well, I cannot tell you all about them until you've reached a very high initiation. He's basically saying here, this is a very profound science. It would be like, somebody who's 15 years old and in, some kind of high school level going to, an advanced scientist, like some biologist or something and say, can you tell me about your most advanced theories? And the person would say, well, look, I can kind of step down my work to something that you could understand being, at that stage of your studies of biology. Because there's no way I could actually explain the complexities because you're not trained enough yet. There's no way that you would understand it fully. So I'll have to oversimplify it, and there's a lot of it that you won't even understand. In fact, in this case, the Tibetan was actually saying, you're probably going to misunderstand it and introduce distortions into it because you're not at the proper level of initiation yet. You can't see it clearly. It's like each stage of initiation is like clarifying your consciousness more and more. And as it clarifies, you see the truth clear. So to reverse that process, if a seventh degree initiate is seeing with a certain profound clarity nature and the order of samsara is very, very crystal clear and revealed, the sixth degree initiate is seeing that a little bit less clear. And a fifth degree initiate even less. By the time you get down to second or third initiation, it's still kind of a rough facsimile of a clear, deeper reality, but it's much more veiled, and there's going to be a seventh degree initiate would look at their understanding and saying, oh, because they're a second or third degree initiate, these are the ways they're misunderstanding and distorting that truth. And as they grow, and it gets to a point where you can't even explain it to a person, like unless they have enough intuition, they simply won't see it. So you can do your best to kind of stretch people to the deeper understanding. But without the intuition, you can only go so far. So the Tibetan was kind of saying to them, like, look, this is a profound thing, and I can give you what I can if you want, but you're going to misunderstand it. I think there's even a sentence in there where he says, will you have what I can tell you, which will be partial and inevitably misleading? So if we really take it to heart what he just said there, he just said, okay, if instead of there being a group of masters in the outer world spending a century revealing the intricacies and the depth of this science, instead, if I give it out to you folks now, you're pretty much going to make a mess of it a little bit. You're going to distort things. You're going to be, And on the very next page of the book in which this appears, of course, in Leadbeater's classic Masters in the Path. And literally on the next page, Leadbeater offers his interpretation of the rays, and it already starts to go off track. There's already misunderstandings, just like the Tibetan predicted there would be. So to me, this is all part of the process. From a certain level of, a point of view, you just sort of see that the very nature of different levels of spiritual development is varying degrees of awakening mixed with varying degrees of still lacking clarity, so that there's inevitably misunderstandings and distortions. And at rather more advanced levels of this work, you start to see universal patterns where you know that there are kind of universal misunderstandings that most spiritual traditions have. And one of those is that we're working with, in a sense, the great ones are working with several kind of fundamental universal misunderstandings in the spiritual traditions of the world right now. And one of them is what we call the ascending perspective, the notion that as you go from element to element or chakra to chakra or plane to plane, that is intrinsically better. It's a more enlightened point of view. That's the ascending model, as we're naming it right now. And it's erroneous. It's a false, distorted understanding. It's common in spiritual traditions. The great ones have a greater clarity that that's not true. But generally, most of the world traditions don't understand that. In fact, some traditions actually don't have the descending misunderstanding; they have a descending false understanding. It's the opposite bias, you might say. So these are kind of I'm bringing this up now because these are examples of misunderstandings that are in the world, spiritual traditions in the world, and are inevitably part of just human spirituality. That we have to look at it less as in a sort of classic model of like truth is known, it's known by specific people and in traditions and in particular books, and we just need to kind of like understand what's being said there, and that's enlightenment. And then we just need to all come on board. But the more modern point of view is it's evolving. Clarity individually, not only do we grow individually on the spiritual path, we come to greater collective maturity spiritually. And right now, one of the common things that's being worked out in world spirituality is this issue of discovering the ways in which the ascending bias is tainting our understanding of spirituality in a variety of ways. And one of those is that some of the modern ways that people have begun talking about the rays is actually still tainted by that ascending bias.